those of you who don't know me, I am Brandon Trebitowski. I run a small agency called Pixagon Inc. So first off, I want to thank John and Nicole for putting on 360 iDev. I know they're not here, but they'll totally be watching the recording. So if you guys are down, let's give them a round of applause for John and Nicole. They put this on every year. It's an incredible conference, and we're super fortunate to have them. So today, I'm going to talk to you guys about how I went from fired to indie to over $1 million in revenue. I know my title sounds a little BuzzFeedy. I think what's missing is what happens next will shock you, right? So you guys may find yourself somewhere along this path. Whether you're working for a company, you're currently indie, or you're looking to expand and build your own sort of company. Today, my hope is to share my experiences, the lessons I learned, the tips, and everything to help you along the way on your journey. So the early days. It all started for me back in 2008. I was a computer science student at the University of New Mexico who actually didn't even own an iPhone. At this point, the iPhone had been out for about a year. We were building those wonderful web applications. However, I knew iOS and iPhone development was going to be the next big thing. So in 2008, the App Store was released. And so I started building software for it and learning. And as I was learning, I realized there was a serious lack of resources on the web. This was obviously because Apple had the NDA in place, but I was a rebellious college kid, so screw the NDA. I started iCodeblog.com. Rest in peace. I'll explain that one in a second. So I worked on iCodeblog for a few months and grew the readership to over 100,000 unique visitors, 10,000 RSS subscribers, etc. And after a while, some companies began to take notice. One of these companies was called Sprite at the time. They eventually rebranded. I got a few of the rebrands there because I'll be referencing them throughout the talk. And they offered to purchase my blog from me and give me my very first job out of college. So backing up for a moment, if you know anything about computer science students in New Mexico, basically the computer science program there is to funnel everybody into the government contracted labs. So you go to Sandia, Los Alamos, Ultraman, one of those labs, etc. And I had actually already had a job lined up at Lockheed Martin right here in Colorado Springs. We'd accepted the job, my wife and I were packing, we were getting ready to go, and along came this job offer. So this was to work remote and build iOS software. It was brand spanking new. And my wife and I talked about it and decided, hey, let's just take a risk. So I declined that job and took the job with Sprite. They also purchased my blog for a whopping $5,000, which I realize now at this point I totally undersold the blog, but at that point I had to pay tuition, ramen, that sort of thing college kids do. And so that got me by. So then I would go ahead and I would work for Sprite for the next few years. During that time frame, I would build 40 or 50 iOS applications. I became their first mobile developer, managing a team, hiring, firing, but most importantly, I learned the full agency pipeline. I learned everything from the sales cycle to contracts, development, maintenance, etc. So I was extremely fortunate to have been given that position. Also during that same time frame, I published a few books through the Ray Winderlich tutorial team, through Manning Publishing, etc. And if you know anything about publishing technical books, especially Chasing Apple's Tail, it's a huge pain in the butt. One time I was at a WWDC party, and we're mingling, and I'm drinking, and I'm bragging, hey, oh yeah, totally just finished my book, and this guy looks at me and goes, man, your mom must be so proud. So I never bragged about the book ever again. So moving on, we need to talk. So after, I would say about 3.5, 4 years, Sprite was acquired and eventually rebranded as Burnside Digital. So within the acquisition, we got a new CEO, and him and I never really quite saw eye to eye. We sort of just butt heads. At this point, I was the top of the company. I was making, 6-figure salary, which was great. I was 27 years old, making 6 figures, and I was the director of mobile engineering, had a team of 17 developers working underneath me. So one day, December 3rd, 2012, I get a Skype message that says, Brandon, do you have a second to talk? So I didn't think anything of it, and I said, yeah, sure, give me a moment. Went to check my email, go to check my Gmail, and I'm locked out. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is not going to be a good talk. This is like a talk that your girlfriend in high school wants to give you. So I pull up my Skype message and see the CEO on the screen, and he goes, "Brandon, we're restructuring the company and your position has been eliminated." And I was like, "Can you give me any more explanation than this?" He said, "Nope." Click, and hung up, and those were the last words we spoke together. This guy actually used to fire people for a living. People hired him to go fire people. So this was sort of his method. So I shook it off, took my family to the zoo, and hit the ground running very next day. So this was basically my first time being indie in the consulting space anyway. I didn't have any of my own apps or in the apps or anything. However, I did have a small sort of side gig that was sort of getting me by during that month of December, but it became very apparent that I needed to start selling. I needed to start getting myself out there and figuring out what I was going to do next. So the very first question I had to ask myself was, how do I brand myself? How do I organize my business? Do I do this under Brandon Trebitowski? Do I go LLC, S Corp, C Corp, all these options? And after consulting and meeting with some advisors, I landed on an LLC. And thus Treb Studios LLC came about because it was the easiest from a tax perspective. The very next question I had for myself, and I get this from everybody, how do you find clients? How do you find your first client? Well, it turns out to be a number of things. I take myself to be a Google master, as many of you, I'm sure, do as well. So I simply started typing iPhone development contracts. And you wouldn't believe the sea of work that came up. Obviously, you had to wade through a lot of junk on Odesk and Lark and all those other O systems. And then after that, I would also reach out to former clients and contacts. I would get a meeting with anyone and everyone who would actually talk to me. Literally every single day, I look back at my calendar, I had a meeting scheduled for every single day for 3 weeks straight. Just talking to people. Now, it might not even be about iPhone development, but I knew some way down the line, these people would either connect me with people or they would have a project for me at some point in my career. So really, networking was my number one asset early on. Excuse me. And then I did some of the other typical things like beefing up my LinkedIn profile, blogging, going on Twitter, developer meetups, etc. Now, I landed my first contract I was on the previous slide. I landed my first contract at the end of December. It was actually 3 days following my severance package ending. So it was a very, very stressful time, but we made it through. Sales tips. So I want to share with you some of the things I learned very early on in the sales cycle. As us developers, we're sort of scared our shoes, introverted kind of guys, and the idea of talking to clients and managing that entire side of the pipeline is just terrifying, and it was terrifying to me. So my number one tip is to be confident. You're the expert. These people are coming to you, and they were coming to me with a product, and they are looking for you for a solution. Whether this is your first meeting, your first sales call with the client, or it's your 1,000th meeting with a sales call with the client, talk to them as if you've been doing this your entire life. They don't know the difference, and that will show through. Another thing, this is a trick I like to do, is keep Google up while I'm on a sales call. Oftentimes, there's just so many technologies and clients and third parties and libraries and frameworks we have to keep up with. And as clients say, "Oh yeah, have you totally heard about this new framework, blah, blah, blah," I'm Googling it as they're talking if I've never heard of it. So I can speak somewhat intelligently about it. So yeah, I've heard of it, but just that second ago. Another challenge you will face on sales calls is if clients always want to get into the price. And I'll talk about some of my other tips for pricing at some point, but they are always balking at pricing. Software development's really expensive, right? We all know this. We read Hacker News and Brennan Dunn and all those guys, push up your prices sort of thing. So oftentimes they say, well, hey, I can get it done cheaper down the road or something like that, or I can hire an India dev team for $4 an hour and they'll crush it. And I usually give them this quote: if you think it's expensive hiring the professional, wait until you hire the amateur. And I tell them I compete on quality, not on price, for this reason. Oftentimes, these clients will have a project in place that they've already been burned by another dev shop or another India shop, and it's your responsibility to provide them with a solution and compete on quality in that scenario. Contracts. This was a huge mistake I made early on, and it's a huge mistake that a lot of indie developers make. They don't have real contracts. We think, oh yeah, we'll talk to this client at the first meeting. Yeah, I'll do it for $10,000, and these are the features, and it's going to be awesome. Sunshine and rainbows. And I'm sure you guys have experienced this. So early on, obviously, I didn't have a contract. But after a while, I realized I absolutely needed a solid contract, something in writing that we could all refer back to, not only for my own sake, but also for the client's sake. So I found a good contract template online. In retrospect, I probably should have used the lawyer, which I currently do. And I usually do a time and materials contract. It's just less risky, less stress between you and the client. There's not all these change orders. You're not constantly telling the client no or yes and having to go back to the scope and things like that. Another benefit of the contract is it helps ensure timely payments. And so we'll talk about lending clients hours in a moment, but I like to say net 15. I like getting paid early and I like getting paid often. And so you can always point the client back to your contract. Hey, 15 days or I have to stop working on your project. Finally, the contract allows us to create a detailed scope that we both agree upon. So if a client says, hey, this is not even close to what I wanted, we can always kind of come back to the scope and say, hey, this is what we discussed up front, and this is what we've agreed upon. Consistency. So as I had my first few contracts and things like that, we struggled with the feast or famine. We all talk about this as indies. There's feast or famine in consulting. So looking back, here are a few things that I did to sort of spread out my risk, if you will, and make sure that I didn't have as much of the famine. As I already touched on, I talked to everybody. I literally, and I still do this, will talk to anyone and everyone. If they shoot me a quick email, hey Brandon, I've got a bogus idea for an Instagram clone for puppies. Also, I know their app's gonna fail. I know I'm probably not gonna build the app for these guys, but I'm happy to talk to them and make the connection. You never know down the road when they want some work done. I also signed up for Oomph, now called Crew, and there's a few other projects. Pickcrew.com. I totally suggest these guys. They're super awesome. These are sort of the response to the Odesk race to the bottom sort of products. They pair up great developers with great clients, and so they'll send you daily emails of new contracts and things that are available. And a lot of these services require that you actually go and interview with them in order to become a part of them. Just a phenomenal resource for consultants to get high quality contracts. Finally, just how I got my start, I blogged. Blogging has been actually my #1 sales pipeline. That's actually my only sales strategy is blogging. I have BrandonTreb.com. I used to write for iCodeblog.com. I wrote on RayWinderlich.com a few times, and blogging has been just immensely beneficial to the pipeline. Because I would, admittedly some of my blog posts are sort of keyword bait, how the top 5 places to find great developers, right? And I would just list a few places and I'd give them bonus number 6 and it would link to my Hire Me page. So another challenge I dealt with very early on and I'm still dealing with and everybody will deal with are taxes. #1 tax tip for a consultant, save at least 35% of your taxes. This turned out to really bite me in the butt my first year. My wife and I remember sitting in front of TurboTax. She is sobbing as the number comes out that we owe $20,000 more than we had thought. And our minds were blown. And this is actually a very common situation with a lot of contractors I've already talked to. That being said, it's a good idea to separate bank accounts, things like that, so that as you're getting paid, 35% goes here, profits go here. And then you will always be ahead of the game with regards to your taxes. Another thing that bit me in the butt were sales tax and gross receipts tax. So gross receipts, not so much. That's only a couple states. I live in New Mexico. It's one of maybe 5 or 6 states that actually has this. This is a flat 7% tax for me that I have no deductions, no control over. Finally, deductions. Keep track of everything. Office expenses, notebooks, things like that you purchase. My wife and I make a game out of it when we're in TurboTax. What else can we write off? We're kind of butt heads on this though because I don't want to write off anything. I'm terrified. I feel like the IRS is going to come get me. But my wife, she's like, hey, I want to go to Target. We can write this off, home office expenses. It's fantastic. All right, so I know I'm just kind of going through indie issues, but I really feel like a lot of us are in the indie phase, and I just want to keep hammering on some of the issues and lessons that I learned early on, because it took a lot for me to get from the indie phase to the full company phase. As I mentioned before, lending clients too many hours was a huge hurdle for me. Let me give you an example. I did this project. It was actually one of my early contracts. We worked on it for maybe 10 months, and I always let the client sort of slip on payments. He's like, oh yeah, I'll pay you, in 6 weeks. And then, payment eventually come. I call him up, hey man, flip me some more cash, sort of thing. And then I'd probably been about a month and a half to 2 months in with this client. And they call me up and they're like, hey, we ran out of funding and we're not going to be able to continue development. So I said, oh, okay, that's whatever. I submitted my final invoice. It was like $8,000. And I never heard from them again. Right? So obviously, as an indie, and especially one of my early contracts, this freaked me out. And this was a huge issue. It was very stressful for the first couple of months. So what this leads me to are collections. How do we handle collections as indies? To be honest with you, it's tough. If you don't live in the same state with people, it's really challenging to even do small claims court, and oftentimes legal fees end up being more than you're trying to collect. So you have to resort to nagging, maybe collections companies, really. But my number one solution to collections is get paid early, get paid often, and don't budge on this. Your clients will respect you because of it. So here we are. It's now early 2014. I've been building my company for a while. Actually, it's just been myself. Been building my name, blogging, things like this. And you'll start to realize this. And this was sort of in my talk, stop saying no, because at some point, you'll see you have a flood of work coming in. Once these pipelines are sort of established and opened up, I was getting 5 to 10 contract offers a week. And I've started to kind of go back on my philosophy of, hey, let's try and offer a solution to everybody. Even if I can't provide them the solution, let me tell them the solution. I don't want to say no to anybody. So the natural next step is to sort of hire contractors and consultants, such as many of you. And so this brings about its own challenges and issues, and so I wanted to share some of the issues and things that I learned along the way. The number one thing you're going to find with contractors is rates. So obviously, I'm all about paying everybody what they're worth. What people feel they're worth, you're paying them as close as that as possible. They're going to do the best job possible. However, contractors come out right at the gate and they say, Brandon, I need $150 an hour. So I'd love to pay these guys $150 an hour. However, sometimes I don't even negotiate $150 an hour. So obviously I'd be losing money on these guys. So I've got to give them some value and reason to give me a better rate so that we can work together instead of them being resentful and saying, Brandon's just trying to nickel and dime me to death. So I remind them of a few factors and a few things that they are getting in exchange for their work. So besides pay, they get consistency. I mentioned to you guys that my pipeline became very thick. I could project out projects for 6 months to a year and keep these guys plenty busy so that they didn't have to do really anything except for write code and get paid. And some people they really appreciate that and they don't want to do anything different. I could also offer contractors security. So I try to keep up to 3 months banked up for every developer I have so that whether or not a client pays me or a client pays me late, I can pay my developers no matter what. And so this is something that I really offer to them. And finally, there's no real sales cycle for them. They just, as I mentioned, they get to just write code and get paid, something that most developers just love doing anyway. One thing I really discovered as I started hiring contractors are moonlighters are not as great as full-time developers. For those of you who don't know what a moonlighter is, these are guys that have full-time work, but they want to make some money on the side. Now, I'm not saying these are bad guys or they do a bad job or anything like this. It's just a challenge working with them because their interests lie with their company. So, for example, when I'm ready to ship a new product and we have a deadline for a client, they might have a deadline that coincides with that for their company, and guess which one's going to take priority. So I really try to strive to hire people who are full-time consultants for other reasons, including they're also very self-motivated. These people are running their own company. You guys are running your own business yourselves, and so you're very self-motivated. You're going to do a good job, you want to meet the deadlines because you want more work. And I also have a little bit better control of their time because I'm not competing with the company that they work for. So one of the common questions I get is, where do you find contractors? I want to expand my business, but I don't know where to find people that I want to work with and that can help me out. They're unreliable, things like that. So the number one place that I find contractors are people I worked for in the past. That company that fired me a couple of years back, they've unfortunately since gone completely under, which is unfortunate for them, but great for me because I just grabbed up all the developers I had previously hired for that company, and now many of them work for me. So previous people you've worked with or worked on projects with is a great place to find developers. Also, developer meetups. We all go to COCO conferences, and we all go to COCO head meetings and things like that. These are like-minded individuals, and you've probably known them for many years, and they're usually looking for similar opportunities. Finally, people at conferences. So, sorry, I was one slide behind. People at conferences. So I actually found my number one developer, who is now my director of mobile, at 360 iDev a few years ago. We've been friends for many, many years, and he wanted to jump ship from his company, and I said, let's do it, man. And it was fantastic. And so I already had worked with him. I already knew I really liked him, and it was the best way I could have met him. Another challenge we'll find when hiring contractors is how do you ensure consistency and how you ensure that they are qualified for the job? Because there's, and some people will tell me they're a contractor because they can write a Hello World to-do list application. So I craft programmer tests. And oftentimes they're like, programmer tests, those are super lame. Nobody wants to do programmer tests. However, I incentivize people to do the programmer tests by paying them. My tests are paid no matter what. If I hire you, you get paid for that test. If I don't hire you. So it encourages developers and contractors to do their best work, comment the code, and I really get a sense of what it's like really working with those guys. So the transition from indie. So as the company grew, we're hiring contractors, we're getting bigger. It became very apparent that we've sort of outgrown the LLC, and we needed to restructure as an S Corp. I wanted to convert employees to W-2, and we also needed to get a little bit more tricky with our taxes, because under an LLC, you're paying self-employment tax and things like this, and it adds to the tax burden that you shouldn't have to be paying. So in October 2014, I created a new S Corp called Pixagon Inc. So obviously, I just said we ditched the self-employment tax, and it actually saved me $8,000 for those 3 months for the rest of the year, because self-employment tax is a burden of 15%. It also adds a few of the headaches, though, of payroll taxes, workers' comp, insurance, and then you really need a good accountant and a good lawyer. So let's talk a little bit about revenue. So in 2012, my very first month when I got fired, I made $12,000 in December. And then my first year of indie, 2013, was just me consulting by myself. I did $136,000 in revenue. Admittedly, most of that went to taxes. And then we come to 2014. So it was a mix of indie and S Corp, as I had said, and this is when I started hiring contractors and expanding. So we did $450,000 in gross revenue. And this year, with negotiated contracts and everything, we were projected at $1.1 million. So it was actually a very short time window from fired to $1 million in sales. Sustainability in the future. I oftentimes get asked, Brandon, what's next? What do you do next? How do you continue forward? Well, obviously, larger clients. This is the only way really for us to go. We have a few large clients now where we can bill out a lot of hours and project out a lot of work. My goal as the president and CEO now at this point is to step away from the code, do more business development, and go hit the road and start selling these larger clients. Also, maintenance contracts. Developers love building applications. Developers hate doing maintenance. Maintenance contracts are an easy sell. They're an easy, recurring, passive revenue, if you will, and they also help you to get through the famine cycles because you can get predictable, consistent income. So, in conclusion, running your own business can be hard, but the rewards greatly outweigh the risks. It's been a great journey, and there are many days when I tell my wife, babe, why can't I just become a potato farmer? And she reminds me of why I did it to be in the first place. Not only was it to provide a steady income for my family with flexibility and freedom, but it was also to help provide jobs to others where they feel valued and appreciated for their work. I can't imagine doing anything else in the world, and I encourage you, if you haven't already, to strike it out on your own and become my competition. I thank you for your time and your attention, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have at this time.
How do you structure like a maintenance contract thing that you have going? Are they time and materials as well?
For maintenance contracts, I really try to avoid time and materials. That's sort of the goal of them. Oftentimes I will say, hey, we'll give you unlimited crash fixes for a fixed price, or small jobs, and that's where the lawyer fun times come in to define what are small jobs. Anyone else? I get tons of questions constantly, so if nobody asks any, I'll start answering some. Marion.
I just wanted to say, Brandon, you're awesome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you. So it depends. Obviously everybody says you've got to be about between $150 and $200 an hour, but that's simply just not the realistic case unless you're trying to hit some of these enterprise clients. For me, I'm finding anywhere from 85 to 150 on the high side. I probably wouldn't go below 85, and I generally only offer that rate to nonprofits. Yes?
What do you think about charging by value instead of rate?
I'm sorry?
What do you think about charging by value features instead of rate?
The question was about charging per value instead of rate. So we've experimented with a lot of this and charging for value for rates. So you mean probably like fixed bid contracts and things like that. These end up being quite a bit of a challenge. I specifically I try to avoid them because we're an agile shop. We like to deliver, weekly builds, things like this, and clients, they like to pivot a lot, and they like to change their features, and I don't like doing change orders and new contracts and things like that. Oftentimes, clients will also have sort of their own third-party systems that you have to work with, and it can sometimes be impossible to scope out the time and effort it's going to be to integrate with these systems. So you either overcharge them and the client pays way too much, or you're undercharging them and you're shooting yourself in the foot. So I feel like sometimes these fixed bid contracts, you're almost putting yourself head-to-head with the client, where you're trying to get it done as quickly as possible, so you might compromise on quality, and the client's trying to bleed you a feature so that they can get the most bang for their buck. Oh, sorry.
So the first thing is partnering with other companies. So for example, do you ever partner with agencies that don't have a good competent development tool for where you can assist them?
Yes, and I actually had this in my talk and I left it out. Apologies. This was actually a great strategy for me. I really try to network with especially all the local web shops in my area, because obviously web is so much different than mobile, and these guys usually will either decline all the mobile work that comes in, or they'll have to just send it out somewhere else. And so a great opportunity is if you can really connect with mobile shops, web shops, and just kind of attach on and say, hey, we're your mobile arm. That really works out well. I've also partnered with some other groups as well. There's some of these groups out there that basically don't have any developers of their own. They call themselves, something group, and basically they're a collective of contractor shops. And so their main goal is just to feed a pipeline, and then they can appear as a big company that has a full agency that has design, development, etc. Partnering with these types of shops is also a great idea.
Hey, Brent. So you alluded to contracts earlier that you might have some kind of scope involved. Now, traditionally, I've seen you have a master service agreement and an SOW or statement of work. In an agile environment, have you structured any kind of SOWs?
Yes. So even though we try to do time and materials contracts, I still like SOWs just to keep everybody on the same page. And SOW meaning statement of work. We have a master agreement, and then SOWs that we attach. And what I like to do is give a client sort of a low to high estimate. So I still have my developers bidding and doing estimations. And so the client, obviously they always say, Brandon, stick to the low estimate, but at least they know the ceiling. And so that way we kind of all benefit. Again, I'm really about providing value. I'm not trying to overcharge these guys. I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable about what they're paying and what they're getting.
So it's kind of a T&M with a cap.
It is a T&M with a cap, and a lot of people say, that's the worst, developers get the worst deal, but I feel like it's helpful for the clients.
What happens when you hit the cap?
You know what? That's just part of the development cycle, and so that's the clients do know that, and I just say most likely it's going to fall into these hour ranges. I don't say it absolutely won't cost more than this. I just tell them this is the low to high most likely. I mean, I guess for us, materials might be, paying for, if we have to leverage third parties, pay for frameworks and SDKs and things like that. It's usually up to the client to front the bill for that.
Can you describe your typical client that you're successful with?
So my typical client, so I've actually found a lot of success in the nonprofit faith-based space. So this is actually a space that a lot of developers sort of tend to avoid. So I'm working with a lot of nonprofits, and then also, I work sometimes with startups as well. We've got some other clients to throw in the mix. We work with Intel and a few others, just that. I really try to steer clear of self-funded projects. So I did that early on, but you'll find that people who are self-funding, or their grandma lent them money to build an app or something like that, these guys are too close to their project. They're too in love with their idea. And so they will be the worst client possible. They're constantly nagging you. They're calling you on Sunday nights, and they don't really have a real concept of what the software development process is like.
Actually, I have a question very similar to that. How do you disqualify a lead versus qualify a lead? Do you have a just general checklist or flags that go up?
Yeah. So one thing is funding right away. Getting a budget together, figuring out what their budget is, and obviously they're willing to probably spend about 25 to 50% more than their budget. Also, how are they funded? Like I said, at this stage in the game, I probably will throw away a lot of the self-funded ones, or even sometimes VC-funded ones, because they're not quite as trustworthy. I will also throw away projects that don't fit in line with my ethics code and that I don't feel right about. I'll give you a quick example. And it's kind of a funny story. So there's this one VC that lives in our town. He's kind of well known, and he said, "Hey Brandon, I've got a quick app for you. Just build it. I'll give you 30% equity, and that's all." And so what he wanted to build was this sort of app so teenagers could sort of ostracize each other, right? So you could build these like chat rooms, but you had to be invited, and you could vote and exclude people and things like that. And I was like, so I almost considered making it because this guy's a very wealthy guy, and he does really well, and so, but I eventually just told him, "Hey man, I'm sorry, I can't take it." So we got beers about 6 months later, and he's like, "Dude, I got to tell you what happened with that project." And so he's like, "Yeah, so I just hired this college kid to build the project, gave him the same deal I offered you, 30%, and then I was talking to my connections at Facebook, and they said, 'Hey, we got this app coming out that's kind of similar to that.' It turns out it was Facebook Rooms. And we don't want you as competition." They wrote me a check for a little over $1 million. I cashed him a check out for $300,000. He didn't write a single line of code. And you win some, you lose some, but you know what? At least I have my principles, Yes, sir.
A little tangentially related to that, can you talk about firing clients?
Firing clients. What specifically would you like to know about firing clients?
How does a contract fit into that?
Well, one nice thing about being on time and materials is there's no guarantee of work for any amount of time or any amount of completion. Obviously, that puts me at risk as well because a client can fire me at any time. So I haven't really had to fire too many clients. I think I fired one client, and I was sort of lame about it. Kind of let the project just fizzle out a little bit. And what I'll end up generally doing is I'm really about providing solutions. I hate getting to the point where I cannot provide a solution to them. So I didn't specifically say, "Hey, I don't like working together. This isn't working out," or anything like that. More or less, what I did was, "Hey, my plate is starting to fill up. Things like this. I really need to direct you elsewhere." And I gave them a list of 4 or 5 people I recommended that they go work with. So I was still able to give another developer some work, still maintain the client's ability to get the project done, and maintain the relationship a little bit.
What about intellectual capital? Like stuff that you produce, is there any legal agreements that says, "I can't take this and go somewhere else with it"?
Yes. So once I got a lawyer, my contract went from 1 page to 12 pages. And so we definitely have a clause in there, unless I'm doing something that's super secret, like I said, we're working for Intel. They own all of that code. There's a clause in my contract that basically says, hey, we own all the code we're making, and you get an unlimited license to it. So, and every now and again, I'll get a client hang up on that, and they'll say, hey, what? This is my project. This is my code. And what I tell them is I say, look, you're benefiting from this clause because I'm bringing years and years of code and all of these code bases that I've already built up in order to save you hours. We're a time and materials shop. So you've probably just saved weeks of work because of this clause. And they're usually pretty agreeable on that.
How many of your customers are local, like to New Mexico or to your city, and how much are like outside of remote?
Yeah.
Red or green?
I'm sorry?
Red or green?
Oh, green for sure. Sometimes Christmas. He's talking about chili. In New Mexico, the question is red or green chili. And these are not jalapenos and they're not peppers. They're just, I don't know, New Mexico green chili. It's delicious. So I would say it's about 50-50. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, the gross receipts tax in New Mexico is brutal. So it's almost as if the state is discouraging all of us to do business in New Mexico because I can write off all of the client work I do outside of the state on my gross receipts tax. So, I mean, and also New Mexico, there's something about it, it's a little behind the times. I don't know if you guys know this. We're probably about 10 years behind everybody else on just about everything. And so clients just, they don't understand the value of good software development. So, people are expecting, $40 an hour rates and things like this to build these silly applications. Yes?
To get to your revenue of 450 this year and 1 million next year, what is the number about? I mean, how many developers and how many contracts does that take?
Yes, so the question was how many developers and contracts and how I'm sort of getting to this revenue. Well, I currently have 4 W-2 contract developers. I mean, not contract, W-2 salaried employees. I hover between probably 4 and 6 contractors, depending on the clients and the workload. I have a project manager who is also contract, an office manager, and a QA person. So that's about what my team currently looks like. We are currently operating on about 7 different contracts. However, we basically have 2 of which are sort of our bread and butter. Longer term, 6-month, year-long contracts that we can really build the company off of. Guaranteed hours every single month, and so I can use that to project out and hire against that.
How many projects do you tend to run at a time to try to keep just the changing contexts from becoming a burden?
Right. So it never really, as of right now with our current size, it never really exceeds 6 or 7. We usually try to keep it around 3 or 4. A really important hire for me was a project manager. So, at one point I was doing project management myself, and it just became just a headache to manage, okay, what's going on in this project, what's going on in this project, all while still trying to sling code, when it came time for production.
Do you split your team up for the different projects?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. I try to keep them one-to-one. However, some of my more generalist guys will sort of float around and help out.
What tools, tricks, or any type of collaboration tools that you use to communicate?
Oh man, Slack. Slack has been huge. And you have to have the Giphy plugin for Slack. So if you don't, you're doing Slack wrong. If you don't know, you type Giphy and then some word and a random animated GIF appears. Some other tools, really, yes, Slack, Hangouts, we use Trello, we use Jira really heavily on the larger projects, but it's sort of overkill on some of the smaller projects. Let me think really what else. I use Write Signature for signing all my contracts, things like that. We were using FreshBooks for a long time, but for keeping track of the books, but I outgrew that, and we're now using QuickBooks. I wish I would have started with QuickBooks on day one. Just spend some time learning it, and it's a very valuable tool. Yes, sir?
So you've been doing this for a while now, and I doubt you start off each project from scratch. So do you have any frameworks that you created to get a project jumped off?
Yeah, so the question was about just frameworks, and as I touched on earlier, we do bring a lot of code and things that we try and reusable libraries, things like this. So just to solve common problems, right? So interfacing with APIs, we have our way that our team likes to do it. getting data from the web to local caches and core data and things like that. We really strive to keep central repositories of reusable code.
How do you go about selecting a lawyer, and how do you price that?
So selecting a lawyer, it turned out to be relatively easy for me. It was one of my close friends. He runs a company, and he has a lawyer on staff, and he ended up recommending him to me, and he was a guy who worked for many years. So just like anything else, I take recommendations very seriously. And then pricing them out, they're expensive. Try to get your lawyer to do project-based work instead of hourly work. My lawyer types really, really slow. I sat there and watched him hunting and pecking. And I was like, I will just give you X amount of dollars for the contract. So I have only a couple of minutes left. I'm doing well. How many minutes left? 2 more minutes, so we'll take 1 or 2 more questions. Yes?
Very important question. Cocoa Pods, cartridge, or GitHub sub-model?
Oh, I'm Cocoa Pods all the way.
What do you do about apps that need a server-side component?
So I actually have a server-side team. I have one guy is sort of my developer operations, lead developer guy, and then I have a few guys working under him. Actually, this day and age, it's not enough to just put an app in the store. You're always going to hit things with server-side components. I would urge anybody who's just like, I'm an iOS developer, go learn Rails or Golang or something of your PHP, at least so you can understand what are all the HTTP verbs and how do we talk to these servers, how do we send cookies and headers and all of these sort of fun things. But to answer your question, it really requires, I think, a dedicated person at some point.
Do you ever work with RFPs to respond to those?
I do sometimes. RFPs, request for proposals. So this is time when people will put out a request, and it's usually, if it's for the government, it's like 1,000 pages for like this little tiny application. If it's one that I feel like we can get and we want to work on, I'll usually throw my project manager on it and let him figure that out. But to be honest with you, it's usually a waste of time, just because it's so much effort up front. We have one with the local university, and it was still a headache working with them. Most companies that want to put out an RFP are not necessarily companies you want to work with. Unless you're of a certain size and you're wanting to do like enterprise and things like that, in my opinion.
Pursue sitters or anything like that?
Pursue what?
Sitters. I don't know if you've ever done any government work. They're much smaller than RFPs and they're limited scope.
No, actually, that's the first I've heard of it. No.
I didn't know how much those are typically researchy kinds of things. So I don't know how much they get involved with.
Okay.
The answer though.
That's all right. Yeah. So I think that's. I think that's my time. So thank you guys so much. It's been awesome. Cheers.